The story is told through the eyes of Gabriel Utterson, a lawyer. Utterson is a man of logic, a man of facts, and a man who values the stability of social order. He isn't prone to flights of fancy or superstition. But even his steady professional world begins to tilt when he discovers a strange clause in the will of his friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll. Jekyll is a respected doctor, a man of high standing and excellent character. Yet, his will contains a provision that makes no sense to Utterson. It leaves everything to a man named Edward Hyde. Utterson has never met Hyde, but the mere mention of him seems to disturb Jekyll. Instead of offering a logical explanation, Jekyll simply insists that Hyde is a friend who should be left alone in the event of his death. As Utterson begins to look into this man, Hyde, he finds someone who is profoundly difficult to describe. He isn't just a criminal or a bad man, he is someone who evokes an immediate, visceral sense of revulsion in anyone who sees him. People can't quite put their finger on why, but there is something fundamentally wrong about his presence, something ape-like and primitive that triggers a deep, instinctive fear. The mystery turns from a legal curiosity into a criminal investigation when Hyde commits a senseless, brutal act of violence. He tramples a young girl in the street, showing no remorse, and later, in a fit of inexplicable rage, he murders a prominent, well-liked man named Sir Danvers Carew. The brutality of the crime shocks London, and Utterson becomes convinced that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll, or perhaps that Jekyll is being held hostage by this monster. As the tension builds, Jekyll begins to withdraw. He becomes a recluse, locking himself away in his laboratory. His servants notice he is changing. He seems more nervous, more haunted. The boundary between the respectable doctor and the violent intruder is beginning to blur, though Utterson still can't understand how they could possibly be linked. The breaking point comes when Jekyll's loyal butler, Poole, approaches Utterson in a state of terror. Poole tells him that he has heard strange, weeping sounds coming from the laboratory, sounds that don't belong to Dr. Jekyll. He's heard footsteps that don't match his master's gait. Most unsettling of all, there is a voice coming from behind the door that is not the voice of the man he has served for years. Utterson and Poole break down the door to the laboratory, and what they find is the end of the mystery and the beginning of a nightmare. They find the body of Edward Hyde, dead by his own hand, having committed suicide with poison. But the man who died is much smaller in stature than Dr. Jekyll. He is wearing Jekyll's clothes, but they are far too large, as if a smaller creature had suddenly inhabited the doctor's garments. Jekyll himself is nowhere to be found. Left behind is a letter from Jekyll, which directs Utterson to two different narratives that explain everything. The first is a letter from a mutual friend, Dr. Lanyon, who has been driven to a state of shock by what he witnessed. Lanyon describes a scene that defies all scientific reason. He watched a man, through a chemical reaction, physically transform into a different person. It was a sight so grotesque and unnatural that it shattered his belief in the rational world. The second narrative is Jekyll's own confession, and it is here that we finally understand the horror of his experiment. Jekyll reveals that he had long struggled with the duality of his own nature. He was a man of high ambitions and high morals, but he also possessed deep-seated, darker impulses that he felt he had to repress to remain a respected member of Victorian society. He felt the weight of his reputation was a prison, and he began to wonder if it were possible to separate the good from the evil, to create a way to indulge his darker side without the consequence of social shame or moral guilt. Through chemistry, he succeeded. He developed a salt that, when ingested, allowed him to physically transform into Edward Hyde. Initially, the experience was a liberation. As Hyde, Jekyll could walk the streets, indulge in his vices, and act on his most primal urges without any of the crushing weight of his social identity. He could be the man he secretly wanted to be, and when he was finished, he could simply take the drug again and return to his life as the respectable Dr. Jekyll. It was a controlled experiment, a way to compartmentalize the soul. But the control was an illusion. The relationship between Jekyll and Hyde became parasitic. The more Jekyll indulged in the freedom of being Hyde, the more the two identities began to merge and compete. Hyde was not just a mask, he was a growing, sentient force of pure, concentrated malice. The most terrifying development was that the transformation eventually became involuntary. Jekyll began to wake up in the middle of the night as Hyde, without having taken any drugs at all. His body was changing on its own. The ape-like nature of Hyde wasn't just a description of his appearance, it represented a regression, a descent back toward a primal, animalistic state of being. The final tragedy was a matter of chemistry and fate. Jekyll discovered that the original, successful batches of the drug he used to transform had contained an accidental impurity. It was this impurity that had made the transformation possible. As he used up his supply of the original salt, he tried to make more of it, but the new, pure version failed to work. He was stuck as Jekyll, but he was losing the ability to stay that way. He was being consumed by the very darkness he thought he could manage. As his supply of the original, effective powder ran out, Jekyll realized he was facing a permanent transformation. He was losing his identity, his face, and his soul to the entity of Hyde. The story ends with Jekyll's final, desperate realization that the battle for his own selfhood is lost. He is left waiting for the end, caught in the terrifying space between being a man and being a monster. When we look back at this story, it's easy to see why it has endured. Stevenson wasn't just writing a ghost story, he was writing about the human condition. One of the most striking themes is the idea of duality. We often think of ourselves as unified beings, but Stevenson suggests that the human psyche is a battlefield. There is a tension between the persona we present to the world, the Jekyll that follows the rules and maintains the social contract, and the primal, unvarnished impulses that exist beneath the surface. The horror of the book isn't just that Hyde is evil, but that Hyde is a part of Jekyll. They aren't two different people, they are two versions of the same man. This leads us to the theme of loss of control. Jekyll's journey is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to bypass the consequences of our actions. He wanted the pleasure of the impulse without the responsibility of the identity. He thought he could use science to master his own morality, but in doing so, he became an addict. The drug becomes a metaphor for the way we often lose ourselves to our impulses, whether they are literal substances or more metaphorical escapes. The more we indulge the parts of ourselves that we try to hide, the more those parts begin to demand our attention, until eventually they are the only things left. There is also the theme of regression. In the Victorian era, there was a profound fear of de-evolution, the idea that humanity could slip backward from a civilized state into something more animalistic. By making Hyde ape-like, Stevenson taps into that deep-seated anxiety. Hyde is a representation of the primitive, the unrefined, and the predatory. He is what happens when the veneer of civilization is stripped away. The concept of the impurity in the chemical salt is perhaps the most profound part of the metaphor. It suggests that the darkness isn't something we create through a specific, calculated act, but something that is accidentally woven into the very fabric of our being. It implies that the capacity for evil isn't a separate ingredient we add to our lives, but a fundamental component of our nature that we simply fail to filter out. In the end, the tragedy of Dr. Jekyll is that he tried to solve a psychological problem with a physical solution. He thought he could use chemistry to divide the soul, but the soul cannot be partitioned without destroying the whole. By trying to isolate his darkness, he only gave it the space to grow until it became his entire reality. The story leaves us with a chilling thought. The monster isn't someone lurking in the shadows of a foggy London street. The monster is the version of ourselves we try most desperately to hide, and the more we try to separate it from our lives, the more power we give it to eventually take us over.